welcome to another edition of Christian Answers for today. And we are going to be focusing on today the review of the television series A.D. the Bible Continues. Now, we were talking about A.D. the Bible Continues a few weeks ago. Then we got on another topic, but we're back to A.D. the Bible Continues because now the A.D. the Bible Continues television series is now in its 5th week and quickly coming up on the 6th week, and I wanted to just jump in and talk about some of the developments in the series. Now, the first 2 or 3 of this television series, A.D. the Bible Continues, broadcast on NBC every Sunday night for a certain time, about 2 or 3 months. The first 2 or 3 series episodes were very, very closely following the biblical book of Acts, and they were a summary of the life and times of Jesus Christ and some of the events that happened in the early church. Now, the next couple of episodes do a little bit more creative scene creation, and that what I mean by that is they go and take a lot of liberties with the script. Now, as you can imagine, if you're a writer, if you're a producer, and you are trying to produce a television show that will depict the early church, you're going to go to the book of Acts. But what you find there is not a lot of details. You find some general outlines of what's happening in the early church, but you don't see a lot of the details that you might want. So what that forces you to do is use your imagination, use your creativity, and come up with different scenarios that seem plausible according to the Bible. For example, right now in the series A.D. the Bible Continues, the emphasis seems to be on how the leaders of the culture, the Jewish leaders, the Roman leaders, are reacting to the early Christian movement. And so a lot of the episodes are focusing on the reaction of the high priest Caiaphas and also the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate. And so you have Caiaphas, the high priest, and Pontius Pilate, and a lot of the depictions and the reenactments involving these two men. Now, the problem with that is the Bible doesn't tell us a lot about these two men other than just general and basic things that we know from the Scriptures. So what happens is the writers, producers, directors of the Bible series on TV, they're having to fill in the blanks. And the problem with that is we don't know how accurate it actually is. For example, Caiaphas is shown in every single episode, and there is a lot of time spent with Caiaphas, the high priest. And not only Caiaphas, but his wife. Now, this is really a stretch, but I think it was put in there because of the fact that we live in a society where the feminist movement has happened in the 70s. And so society expects to see a lot of women characters in the television programming and movie programming that it views. And so if the creators of the Bible series A.D. the Bible Continues were to simply go according to the book of Acts, there wouldn't be a wife mentioned for Caiaphas. And so he would be acting on his own, and he would be making decisions and taking action on his own. But according to the modern perspective, they want to see women involved in the plots. And actually in our culture today, if you look at the movies out like The Hunger Games and so forth, you will see women actually taking the lead and being the leaders of groups and being the leaders of movements. And so that's all in keeping with the modern feminist movement. And so when we come to the Bible series, lo and behold, we see the prominence of women in the biblical texts where there is no biblical text to actually support it. So these are recreations. Caiaphas is mentioned in the Bible. It does show things that he says and does, but it doesn't show or say or mention anything about his wife, but we see her as a prominent character in the Bible series on television. That's a modern anachronism, but it's one that the writers, producers, directors felt was important. If you're going to fill in the blanks, maybe fill in the blanks with something that the modern audience is already used to. And so, in the series on television, we see Caiaphas' wife doing a lot of things, going to this place and going to that place and talking to this person and talking to this, always involved in the decision-making of her husband, Caiaphas. And again, we don't know if that in fact happened. And actually, if you are going to sit down with a group of Bible scholars, Hebrew and Christian, and ask them what would be the typical decision-making pattern of the high priest, the Jewish high priest, they would probably come to the consensus that the wife of Caiaphas was probably not right there helping him make decisions, being his general counsel, and being there in all of the important events. Probably she would not be as prominent or nearly as prominent as she is in this television series. In fact, she would probably be more in the background, behind the scenes, like most women were in the first century culture. So again, the Bible, the Bible continues, is trying to be relevant, it's trying to be current and modern, and it's trying to show the way things were way back then, but in so doing, it's reading into history our own modern tastes and preferences. And, as I said before, that's not always bad, especially if you have to fill in the blanks for a scene. Why not show it more relevant today, since we don't exactly know what happened in between the blanks? The directors, writers, and producers are trying to be relevant and trying to follow the basic Bible script. And also, it doesn't take away much from the actual biblical account to show, for example, Caiaphas' wife being right there by her husband's side, talking to him, giving her input and helping him make decisions. It doesn't take away too much from it, but one of the things that we see also in the Bible series is Pontius Pilate, the Roman leader. His wife also plays a prominent role in the decision-making and the input of Pilate. And this, again, is catering to the modern tastes, post-feminist America. And so we're seeing, again, Pilate's wife, who we do meet in the pages of the New Testament, because she does mention to Pilate during the trial of Jesus to leave Jesus alone, he's an innocent man, and so forth. So we do actually see her and hear her words in the New Testament, as opposed to Caiaphas' wife, who is not even mentioned in the New Testament. We do see Pontius Pilate's wife, Claudia, mentioned in the New Testament, but nowhere near the prominence that she's given in the Bible series AD. So again, I just mentioned this. We'll talk more about this in the second segment of Christian Answers, so don't go away. Well, welcome to the second segment of our Christian Answers for Today program. And I was talking about the role that the women in the Bible series on television are playing, especially Caiaphas' wife and also Pontius Pilate's wife, Claudia. Now, what is interesting is the Bible, the Bible continues, writers, directors, and producers do put in these women in a fairly major role in the series, whereas in the Bible they are not put in any kind of prominent role. I mentioned before that Caiaphas' wife is not even mentioned in the Bible. Claudia, the wife of Pilate, is mentioned, but very briefly. But here in the Bible series on television, they are given very predominant roles, and that might be a stretch of the imagination. It might be something that is being read into the story because it seems to make sense to us modern people in our modern age. And so that's why it was probably put in there. But again, we don't know to what extent that these women actually did have influence over their husbands and were involved in the decision making that led to the events that happened in the early church. Now, one of the other things we should note is that Caiaphas and Pontius Pilate in the Bible series movie or television show, they play prominent roles in the continuing drama of the early Christianity unfolding. Now, this is something that we're not quite sure actually took place also. It shows Caiaphas involved in trying to suppress the early Christian movement, which probably was true, although we don't have a lot of evidence that, or actually know what steps he did take to try to suppress the early Christian movement. We do know that the Apostle Paul was working under the authority of these Jewish leaders, and he was persecuting Christians. But we see some of the scenarios in the Bible, continues AD, that we don't really know if they took place or if these are just simply guesses that might have been something that happened along the way. And so we have to ask ourselves, is this really accurate or is this pure fiction? Now, one of the things that occurred in the first 2 or 3 episodes of AD, The Bible Continues, is that you could track it along with the Bible fairly closely. During the first, second, and third segments of the episode, you could see that, yes, indeed, this Bible story was actually being told with a close eye to the Scriptures, because there was actually a lot of biblical data available for the writers, producers, directors to actually rely on. As you get further along in the Christian movement, the data becomes scarcer and scarcer. The book of Acts becomes more generalized, except in some rare instances where they actually do give details, for example, like the Jerusalem Council and some of the sermons of Peter and some of the other adventures of Paul. They're given some basic information. But mostly the early development of the Christian movement is not mentioned in detail. So the writers, producers, directors of the Bible series have to come up with their own scenarios. And what they have done is they have put together a narrative that included Pontius Pilate and Caiaphas in their own ways trying to suppress the Christian movement. Now, one of the big scenes in the early episodes of this series is that there was a zealot who tried to murder Pilate, and he didn't get away with it, and he murdered another soldier. Then all of the Roman soldiers and Pilate are trying to hunt this man down. In the process, they decide they're going to be killing Jews one by one, even 10 at a time, until they find this Jewish murderer. And so it shows that the Jewish community was being punished because of this zealot, his attempted murder of Pilate, and his actual murder of a Roman soldier. Now, did that actually happen? I think what the writers, producers, and directors of the Bible series are doing is they're collecting some accounts that happened at some point during the Roman occupation of the Jewish nation, and they're kind of conflating them all together and saying this is a possible scenario that happened after Jesus rose from the dead and after he ascended into heaven and the early Christian movement began. And they're trying to put that into the theme of the early Christian church. Now, it shows in this series, it shows that Christianity, actually the leaders and some of the early believers, they moved out of Jerusalem, and that they moved into a camp outside of Jerusalem. And so they had a Christian camp outside of the city. Now, I had never heard of that before. I had never read of that before in the history books. I had always assumed that the Christian movement was born and grew up in Jerusalem and not separate outside of Jerusalem. I knew that Peter and the other disciples had shuttled back and forth between Galilee and Jerusalem, but I did not vision in my mind, nor have I ever heard or read that Christianity had a camp of believers outside of the city and they stayed there. And in this series, in the television series, they try to depict Peter forming this camp on some land and some property. Now, they use the scenario of Ananias and Sapphira, and they show that these two people, this couple, donated some money from the sale of some land, and then they brought the money to the disciples, but they had kept back some of the money, yet they claimed that they had given all the money to the disciples for the Christian movement. And they showed they were being confronted on their lie. It shows that God punished them by death. He actually struck them down through a natural process. They had a heart attack or some kind of a natural physical problem, and they both died, the couple that had lied about the money. But then it shows the Christians on this land, so I'm wondering, where do they get that land from? Is that supposed to be the land that Ananias and Sapphira had sold, supposedly sold, and given the money to the Christian movement? Was that in fact the land? They had actually kept the land too. I don't quite understand where the Christians got that land in this Bible series, and I'm not sure that actually that is factually correct. I'm not sure that Christians actually moved out of the city of Jerusalem, and that Peter and the leaders, the disciples, actually planted a Christian base camp outside of the city, because that's what this television series shows. So you have to wonder, how much is actual fabrication and how much is actually historically accurate. And this will cause me to go back and study more in history and try to figure out where are they getting some of these reenactments. And so it should cause you to ask the same questions. What is actually biblical and what is actually an imaginative, creative, artistic license that they're taking with this series to try to make it interesting and connect the pieces. So we'll talk more about this in part 3. Stay tuned. Don't go away. Okay, well, welcome back to the third and final segment of Christian Answers for today. And we're talking about AD, The Bible Continues, the television series. I hope that you've had a chance to watch some of the episodes of this Bible story. It starts out with the crucifixion and death of Christ. It shows the resurrection. Then it shows Jesus' appearance to his disciples, his ascension. And it shows how the early church was formed. It shows the coming of the Holy Spirit. I'm not exactly sure, again, how accurate that was as far as the depiction of the Holy Spirit coming upon the disciples in the upper room at Pentecost. Nobody actually knows how or what it actually looked like in detail, but they tried to depict it, and it shows them in a prayer meeting. It shows them praying out loud, and all of a sudden the wind comes up and light comes from heaven and fire enters the room, and it shows them beginning to speak and pray with fervor and zeal, and it shows them going out after that and preaching the gospel and telling people about Jesus and being bold and not worrying about what happens and not worrying about what the results will be, and shows them getting put in jail. And it shows some of the very Bible passages that the book of Acts explains. And so they're following the general script of the Bible, but of course they're adding quite a bit in to the script. And they're trying to show how the different biblical verses are connected to one another. That's what you see in the Bible. What you get in the Bible is a summary of what is happening, because obviously if the details were given in every instance of every historical account, there would not be enough room to have a Bible. You couldn't have a book of Acts if all of the details, or even most of the details, were given in every single scenario, because then you would not have a brief summary of the historical Christian movement. You would have a huge library, and the length would be so massive that it would be impractical to get into the hands of Christians around the world. And so the early church was very wise in keeping a summary of what happened, so that we know exactly what happened, but we don't know all the details of what happened. And we have it in a form that's small enough that people can actually digest it and not get bogged down. And also, you have to realize at that time, in the early ancient world, even for the first millennia after the time of Christ, writing was very rare, and only the scholarly class had access to writing. Only after the time of the Reformation did actual printing and books become available for the average person. And so for all those years, 1500 years, most of what was known of Christianity had to be known from the word of mouth. You would go to church to hear about this stuff. You would not actually own a Bible. You would not own a copy of the Bible. The average person could never own a Bible. Churches, individual churches, would be lucky to have a Bible, or even a portion of a Bible, a segment of the Bible. Maybe one or two of the Gospels in the early church they would be lucky enough to have. So writing and reading were not real common in the ancient world. And so you can imagine that the book of Acts is not this huge historical document that goes on many volumes, because that would have been impractical and impossible. So what it was is a summary of what the early Christian movement was, including all of the adventures of Peter and Paul, especially toward the end of the book of Acts. Paul's his life and his activity is emphasized because he was such an important person. Now, the fifth episode in the Bible, AD, gives us a little glimpse of the Apostle Paul, but he's not the apostle at this point. He is Saul of Tarsus, and he is holding the coats of the people who stoned the Christian preacher Stephen, and that's the last scene of episode 5. So we have to wait till episode 6 to see where they're going to take the story with the Apostle Paul. And that should be interesting, because we do have more information about Paul, fortunately, in the book of Acts than we do many of the other disciples. Even Peter, we have more information about Paul than the activities of Peter, except the early stages of the church in which Peter was involved. So it should be interesting. But as you can see, what happens is, as the information becomes more and more scarce, the writers, producers, directors have to create their own scenes. And as they do that, it becomes less and less certain as to whether they get their scenes correctly, whether it actually did happen that way. And so I find myself, when I'm viewing the series on TV, saying, did that actually occur like that? Did that actually even happen? And I'm less and less confident in what I'm seeing as something actually that took place, whereas before, in the first 2 or 3 episodes of this series, I was very confident that what I was seeing at least did occur, and it may have not occurred the same way they're showing it. It may be a little bit different, but at least it did occur. Now I'm beginning to question whether this actually occurred, because if it's not in the Bible, then we don't know for sure actually what's taking place. It could have happened. It could happen. For example, Caiaphas could have been doing the things he's doing in the series. His wife could have been giving input to him. Probably not so much, but she could have. Even Pontius Pilate, he could have been doing what the Bible series shows him, and his wife giving input. But again, we are less confident of these things than we were at the beginning of the series, when they were taking almost directly from the Bible. And so I'm hoping, I still like the series, I still find it really interesting, and it gets me thinking, But I do hope that with the Apostle Paul, they begin to come back to the scenes in the Bible that we see in the pages of the Bible, and then focus on actually filling in those scenes in more detail and taking creative license in filling in those scenes, rather than actually coming up with an entirely different plots and scenes like they have had in the 4th and the 5th episode, because some of the plots of the activities in the 4th and 5th episodes are not even mentioned in the Bible, so they're actually being invented. And they're doing that because I think of the scarcity of information that the Bible is giving us in the book of Acts. So when you watch the series, you have to ask yourself constantly, did this actually happen? And if it did happen, is it being depicted accurately as best we know from the Bible? And also you have to ask yourself the question, are the characters portraying the biblical characters accurately, or is it going off in a different direction that probably is not reflecting the characters in the Bible? And so they're very brave. The producers, writers, directors were very brave for actually putting these scenes out there. But again, as an audience, we have to ask those questions about how accurate are they being, and how truthful is it actually what we're seeing. I'm hoping that people ask those questions, and I'm hoping people don't just uncritically think that whatever they're seeing, that is in the Bible. Unfortunately, a lot of our people today don't follow the Bible real closely. They don't read the Bible. They don't study the Bible very closely or at all. And so when they watch something like this, The Bible Continues, they may assume, well, this is all in the Bible. Actually, a lot of what we're seeing now is not technically, literally in the Bible. But again, it's more of a creative license they're having with the script. They're having to fill in the blanks. So hopefully when we see the Apostle Paul and see his adventures and see his life, that the writers, producers, directors of the series go a little bit further, closer into the literal, strict following of the Bible, not so much in creating their own scenes and plots. And hopefully it will return to a more authentic depiction of the biblical stories. Well, don't go away. We're going to be back next week, and we're hoping that you're going to be tuning in again. God bless you until next week.